Okay, somebody asked if I can record this session, and I just started streaming it to YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/AgileLnL, you'll be able to find it, and it'll be posted there as soon as we're done. I'll try to share it out. If you can't find it for some reason, though, ping me, and I'll make sure I can send you a link to it. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Selenium today. Let me make sure it's time. Oh yeah, we're right at the top of the hour. Perfect. Hang on, my dog just was given a pig's ear, and we're gonna have noisy smacking unless I get her upstairs. I'll be right back. Okay, Bill, upstairs. Take it upstairs. Here you go. Come on. Hey. She's smacking loud. Sorry about that. I was going to be very distracted. She's kind of noisy. Okay, let me make one more change here. I have a little bit of a different setup now to where I can see everyone a little bit better. So if you want to be on video, you can let me see the expression on your face as we talk about things. That's great. Also, everybody give me a thumbs up if you can find a thumbs up or thumbs down list. I just want to make sure that's working. Click on the thumbs up or thumbs down. All right, okay, we got that working. Feel free to mash those buttons however you happen to be feeling. In lieu of being able to see everybody, that works well. But like I said, if you want to be on video, I've got it set up to where I can see people right behind the camera now. Okay, so we're talking about Selenium. Not necessarily the element, but that's what it's named after. First question for everybody is, how do you feel about Selenium? And let me know in the chat if you can't get to this. The polls should have popped up kind of on the right-hand side. I think on the right-hand side of where you see my box presenting. So how does everybody feel about Selenium? And you can click anywhere you want. Okay, so it looks like we've got a lot of people are kind of in the middle with it. We don't have anyone that's angry about it, which makes me wonder if a lot of us are new to Selenium, because if you have not experienced anger about Selenium, you probably just haven't used it long enough. Selenium's great, but there's always times where it's been frustrating. But it looks like most of us are pretty positive, which is great, and it may say something about how much they've improved things over the years. So that's awesome. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is Selenium. Let me give you kind of an overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to go through, talk about Selenium. We'll cover kind of things at a theoretical level for probably the first half of the talk. If you're just wanting to have an idea of what the terms mean, that's probably the part you're going to be interested in. When we get through with that, we'll do a quiz, give away a book, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to show an actual project. We're going to go through a project that uses Selenium and kind of show how it works and run it live and let you see how those things work. So that'll be the second half. We're going to divide them up just in case some people are just interested in kind of like the overview but don't really care for looking at code as much. We'll have some code in this part as well. Okay, so what is Selenium? It's a tool, a library, but it gets kind of confusing because there's lots of different parts of it. So we've got the Selenium WebDriver, and what Selenium WebDriver does is it gives you a way of interacting with a web browser. So if you have Selenium WebDriver, it gives you a way to remote control a web browser. As a matter of fact, when a browser is being remote controlled, I think it still does this, it shows you a little robot at the top to say it's being remote controlled. So it gives you an API that lets you do things like go to a particular URL, and then locate a particular link on the page, and then click on that link, and then go look somewhere else on the page and see what data is in that particular place. There's also a Selenium IDE, which lets you try to record things from your web browser as you click through, and then put it into ways that you can play it back. Sometimes that's useful if you need to do something and then get it into code. If you're wanting to see what would this look like, code to go here, click on this, click on things. As nice as that sounds, being able to record it and then play it back, or record it and then turn it into code, my experience has been it usually produces code things that are very, very brittle. Now, if for some reason you have an online sweepstakes that's giving something away and they'll let you enter as many times as you want, this could be a great way to simply automate it in a purely hypothetical situation of that ever happening. But if you're trying to do complicated things and grow your code being driven by tests, this may not be the best way to this looks like a way to make it go a lot faster. In the long run, a lot of times it's slower, but it is there. You need to, it may be useful. Sometimes it's nice as you're learning Selenium to try to click through the browser and then see what code it produces. I think this will let you actually, I think it still lets you actually spit out code that you can then place into your like your Java code or whatever you're running. So anyway, be aware of that. So we've got the WebDriver that lets you control stuff. We've got this, which is another way, the Selenium IDE, which lets you kind of record stuff and maybe see what you're doing without being in necessarily a programming language. And then we've got the Selenium Grid. And the Selenium Grid lets you, instead of just using WebDriver to control a particular web browser, you can talk to the grid and it can go out and control many different web browsers. So it lets you do things in parallel. It lets you do things like have a Windows machine and a Mac and a Linux machine all being controlled through this one grid and pointing different places. I think you can even do some things with mobile, at least that they were working on that at one time. Okay, so question for you. Are you using Selenium on your project today? Let's see what everybody thinks. Oh, see, we've got about 70 or 80 people here. I was expecting it to be a lower turnout because I kind of let this did this at the last minute. I think we will probably do one more Lunch and Learn next week and then take a little bit of break for the holidays, unless you guys just want to plow through the holidays. But you can tell me your opinion and we'll see. In the past, before Christmas, we've done an Agile game day, give lots of stuff away. So, what were you saying? Okay, it looks like, let's show me how many people have participated. Okay, it looks like we've got quite a few people using it today, some people interested in using it, and then about half of us are here because we probably won't use it anytime soon, but just curious to learn something about it. Or you thought I was talking about medicine or dandruff shampoo, those things Selenium was used for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Selenium WebDriver. So usually you end up with something that looks something like this, just conceptually and how it works. So over here we've got Chrome, and Chrome is the browser that we're wanting to drive. You can drive other browsers with it. I'm just going to use Chrome as the example. We could be Firefox, could be Edge, Opera as well, I think. And then talking to Chrome, so we've got Chrome here, we're going to talk to Chrome, but we do that through the Chrome executable, the Chrome driver executable. So there's this code that people make that work closely with Chrome that follows the API that Selenium is going to call that lets us remote control the Chrome browser. And then we have a programming language that actually drives Selenium. And there are ways to drive Selenium using JavaScript, Java, Python. There's lots of different ways. We're going to use Java for our examples here, but you're not limited to just Java. So what does Selenium code look like? So if you don't read code, that's fine. This isn't a big deal. But let me just show you what a very, very simple Selenium example. So we've got a line here that, finger disappears, sets a property, says, where's the Chrome driver? I need a driver to be able to remote control stuff. And then the next line there, we're actually creating an instance of that Chrome driver. And then the next line here, we're actually getting a URL. So if the code doesn't make any sense, don't worry too much about it. Just notice this is what we do. So we're calling WebDriver get, and it's going to that URL, which means a browser is actually coming up somewhere and then going to this location. Now, there are ways to run it headless so you don't actually see it on the screen, but under normal circumstances, it's actually coming up, and if we run this code, it will come up and you'll be able to see it. And in the second half of the talk, we're going to go through and look at some of those things. So once we've got that, what might we want to do with it? Well, here's an example of what could be a simple test. So here's a very simple test. What this test is doing is the first part's the same, right? We're creating a Chrome driver, and then we're going to a location. In this case, we've got, we're going to localhost, so just what's running on our computer, and then we're pulling that other piece, get environment variable, basically says, where, in this case, where did Spring start up? I want to make sure I'm pointing at whatever port Spring is running on. Anyway, we go to that page that Spring has brought up, because our application is in Spring in this particular example. I see somebody raising their hand. Did you have a question about some of it, or you may have just clicked on something? That's cool too. Okay. I'm also keeping an eye on the chat, so if anybody needs clarity or wants to highlight something, feel free to type something in there or speak up. That's great. Okay, so we go to that page. We're on the localhost page. So whatever the page of our application is, like I said, the example we're using is that it was actually started up in Spring, but it could be anything. We could even point it out somewhere at the internet. I've been in lots of places where they were actually testing this against something that was deployed in AWS. So they'd work on stuff locally, deploy it to AWS, and then point at it and run it there. Can work really, really good if you have really fast cycle time of being able to deploy stuff. If it takes 10 minutes, that's kind of frustrating. Yes, so in this particular example, we're going to be using Spring. Now, what I've shown you here so far is really independent of Spring, right? This doesn't have it, other than the fact that Spring is what was going to set that local server port for us. Okay, and the next thing we do here, and this gets into a little bit of HTML, but we have something on the page that has an ID called adder first number. And we're saying, I want to go find the element. So this line right up there, if we go over here, that way, it says find the element called adder first number, and then I'm going to send the keys to it, the number 6. Okay, and there's some stuff I've got to jump through of converting the integer to a string before sending it. We're sending the number 6 to it. Then we're going to go and find the ID that has second number in this line right here, and we're going to send the number 4 to it. Then we're going to find the element that says adder button, and we're going to click that button. So if you see that find element by ID, and it's got all of that information, then we're calling the click method on that. And then we're going to go back out, and this line right here in our test is going to go and look for an element called the results. We're going to go find the results, take those results off, turn it into an integer, and compare it with the number 10, and that's what we expect it to actually be. So the details of all the code here isn't particularly interesting, but what I do want you to see is we're looking at the page and going through things that we can identify on the page, usually by the ID. It's not necessarily the location on the page, but it's how the HTML has named things on the page. If you've worked with some older test automation stuff, you may be familiar with where they would actually say, okay, maximize the browser and then go to this particular location and click. And hopefully that's going to be in the input box, and then type something and then go to this location and click. With Selenium, we're dealing with the structure of the page as it's defined in HTML, not necessarily where it is on the page, which means if your browser is a little bit smaller, or it should work the same if you're on different size, if your browsers are different sizes, or if you're on different size monitors that you're running. You should be kind of independent of the exact location because we're going for the HTML ID. And there's a bunch of different ways to locate stuff. In this case, we're looking at the ID. So the WebDriver philosophy, and this is something that gets kind of interesting. I'll give some examples of where this shows up in just a minute. But the WebDriver philosophy is basically, if a user can do this on the page, so if a user can go to your web page and click on something or see something, that's what they want WebDriver to be able to do. And in some cases, they've also tried to say, if it's not something the user could do by going to the page, it's not something we want to actually build into WebDriver. So you'll see lots of, if you dig into the development efforts behind that, you'll see lots of people suggesting, oh, it'd be great if we had this feature. And they're like, a user couldn't actually do that, so we're not going to build it into WebDriver. So this is, this sounds like a great thing, but you will eventually, and I think it's a good place for them to be at. The problem comes when you start needing to do something like inject an authentication header into it for your test. So because you're testing this, you need to put an authentication header into it for all the interactions. And if the philosophy is you can't do it unless a user would do it, WebDriver would say, no, we're not going to build that into our stuff. We're not going to build that into WebDriver. So you end up either needing to, what you end up doing, or what happens sometimes, is you end up with a situation where I need to log this in. I need to get past the authentication to test stuff, but to log in, I need a real person with like a ID card or something to get logged in. Well, that may not be the way that you want to do it. And there's some ways around that. We won't really cover it in this class. There are some ways to create a proxy that WebDriver goes through that lets you inject some of these other things into there. And some of the stuff gets a lot more complicated. If you're interested in any of that, email me. I'd love to talk to you about it. But for now, the thing interesting for this talk is just that the WebDriver philosophy is, if a user can do it, we're going to try to build it into WebDriver. If a user cannot do it, it's not necessarily something we're going to build in. We probably won't put it into WebDriver. You need to find another way to do it. Okay, so here's a fun question for you. How did Selenium get its name? So take your best guess how Selenium got its name. Was it created by a developer who had formerly been a chemistry teacher? The creators were heavy users of Selsun Blue shampoo with Selenium, which is a dandruff shampoo. The creators liked the fact that it would bind with mercury, or they just randomly pointed out a word in the dictionary. So what do you think? All right, so the right, I think these are all could be very good answers. Around the time Selenium was being created, there was a company, it eventually sold to HP, I can't remember what it was called, but they had a product that would do some type of automated testing, and it was called Mercury. I think it became known as HP Testing Center or something like that at one point. I don't remember the name. You guys are probably more familiar with it than I am if you're working in the QA world. Anyway, it was mercury. Well, selenium is the antidote to mercury poisoning. So if you accidentally ingest mercury, which you should not do, selenium is what they will give you to try to bind with the mercury so it will move out of your body instead of killing you. HP Quality Center. Yes, that's it. Thank you. So by calling it selenium, it was basically saying this is the antidote to the poison that is known as mercury, which was another testing product, which is a fun fact. Okay, so let's talk about some patterns for using Selenium. So one very important thing I've seen when you're using Selenium, and a lot of test setup, but particularly especially with Selenium, is you need some type of central configuration. What you don't want to try to do is be in a place where every single test needs to set up all your Selenium setup. And this is oftentimes when you're seeing example code, they'll give you a small snippet that does everything you need, and it can, if you're just starting with Selenium, it can kind of push you toward setting all that stuff up in one place. Like, for example, the code that I just showed you where we went out and we loaded, we had to go out and get the ID for the, the port number. You probably don't want your port numbers. An example that you might see is something that has the port number encoded just directly in the test. You probably don't want it in every single test. That's something that would be better as central configuration. You also probably don't want to be in a situation where every single test goes out and creates a new WebDriver, creates a new Chrome driver. Even though we kind of showed that in our example, that's probably something that needs to be centralized somewhere and then using a singleton pattern or something like that. When we get to the code part, I'll show you an example of what that looks like with Spring. It doesn't matter so much how you do it as much as you find some way to do it. Because what works fine when you've got 5 tests, when you get to the point that you've got 5,000 tests, it may not scale as well. So central configuration is one big piece, or one big important pattern for Selenium. Another one is called page objects. So the code I showed you was actually going in and talking directly to Selenium and testing things directly on Selenium. So it was basically written something like this. So we had a test that talks to the UI. So in this case, my test goes into the URL, and then it's going to find the stuff it needs, and then it's going to make an assertion on it. The page object pattern actually sits between here. So if you notice what happens here, this is the same test, but look how much more concise this is. So I'm saying I've got a demo page, and I'm going to go to that page, and then I'm going to, on the demo page, call add numbers. I'm going to add the numbers 5 and 5, and then I'm going to go to that demo page and say what were my results, and make sure that they equal 10. So this is pretty easy to read. Even if you're not a developer, you can probably understand what's going on here. If you're back on this page, you got to kind of understand a lot about what's going on the page and a lot about the API that's talking to Selenium to really make sense of it. So what the page object pattern does is it sets up this level of abstraction between. And the goal is to make it so we can focus more on what the page actually does and less on the mechanics of how the page does it. So in this case, when I've got the go to the demo page and add numbers, that method right there to go to the demo page. So over here, if I add this line to go to that page in every single test, I'm now in the situation where if that ever changes, I've got to change every single test. In this case over here, I've got this go method, and I can just go into that method and change what it does in one place. Same thing with the way that we add the numbers. If we, for some reason, rename these IDs to something different or have a different mechanism for finding those, in this case, I'd have to change it in every test that makes use of that. In this case, I just have to go to that demo page, the page object that's actually representing that page. And this gives us the ability to abstract stuff to where we're able to focus more on what we're trying to do at that time. If I'm just wanting to use a page, I can use the page object for that without having to think through all the details of what's involved in finding those elements, going to those elements, and those types of things. And just as a kind of as a side, when my undergrad and grad degree, first ones were in music composition, and I remember when writing this was for my master's degree, there was a lot of this kind of jumping back from different levels of abstraction of how do you think about the music for full orchestra? How do we think about this for full orchestra from a high level to where I can concentrate on what's important overall? And how can I then go into the details of the individual notes I need to write? So the abstraction becomes very important in a lot of different areas. In this case, we're wanting to have the abstraction of how do I think about what the page does, not necessarily the details of how it does it. Okay, another important pattern, independent tests. When you run your test, you ought to be able to run them in any order and still get the same pass or fail. It shouldn't matter what order you're running your tests in. They should also, you shouldn't have any tests that are dependent on other tests running. You don't want to get in a situation where you have interdependent tests. I've seen teams that start putting lots of setup information in a particular test and say, hey, we're always going to run this test before we run these other tests. That sets you up for lots of pain and suffering in the future. So you want to try to avoid those types of things if you can. Parallel capability. So one of the reasons for making stuff independent is you may get to the point sometime that you want to actually run your tests at the same time. What works just fine with 5 tests, when you get to 5,000 tests and it takes, there was one project I was working on, and on my laptop, we got to the point that to run the full test suite took 24 hours of time. It would take a full 24 hours to run. Now, we were able to make those more parallel and put them on larger boxes and stuff and got it back down to where it would take 20 minutes to run by making it parallel. And one of the big ways we did that was taking the approach of saying, okay, we have, if we need to, we have a user and that we're going to create a user in the system and then go try to log in that user or something. Well, if we just had hard-coded the user Joe in the system, and we're just going to create the user Joe, and we had several tests in parallel trying to use Joe, they'd very likely step on each other's toes. So we couldn't actually run those in parallel. So what we ended up doing is making it Joe. Each test would say, okay, we're going to have Joe, but then we're going to add a random number to the end of it. And for the purposes of that test, everything is Joe 94834, whatever it was. So that insulates the test from all the others. So we could have 100 tests running at the same time using Joe with a different random number after it, and we test all these things in parallel. Then you have to deal with cleanup and stuff like that. But this is a good pattern for trying to be able to do stuff in parallel. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I am going to give away a copy of my productivity book. So we'll give this to whoever wins this quiz. We're just going to look at some of the things we talked about, just 5 questions. And then we're going to go do a demo and actually look at some of what we've been talking about. So if you're not really interested in seeing the actual source code, stay through the end of the quiz, and then you can see if it sounds interesting or not. If you're interested in the code, that's the part we're going to get to in just a second. Okay, so the question is, why did the creators call it Selenium? So I'll give a few more seconds for people to join. And why did they call it Selenium? Was it because they didn't realize it was used in dandruff shampoo, because it would bind with mercury, to make fun of HP, or because it was hard for competitors to say? So click on the, okay, there, we got all responses in. Yes, it's because it would bind with mercury. Very good. And our leaderboard here. All right, got a bunch of people with 1,000 points. Very good. What part of Selenium do you use to control the browser? Do you use the browser controller, the 9-iron, the web flux capacitor, the web controller, or the web driver? Which part do you use to control the browser? Got about 7 seconds left. What part of Selenium do you use to control the browser? And if you're just joining, there should be a, you can either go to the URL that will be listed at the top, or there is a place on WebEx that should show up to the side. And the answer is yes, it is called WebDriver. That's the thing that lets you control the browser. Very good. I was hoping I'd get somebody on the web flux capacitor because that sounds like a very cool name for something, but alas, didn't get it. Okay, leaderboard. We got Arif, Arjun, Astrid, CK. Okay, we got lots of people with full scores. This I may have needed to make this harder. I'm going to be sending out a lot of books, which will be great. What did Mark suggest your testing code should talk to? What should your testing code talk to? Should it test nothing? There should be separation of concerns. Your testing code shouldn't talk to anything. Should it talk to the user interface? Should it talk to the unit? Or should it talk to page objects? What did Mark suggest your code should talk to? Okay, I think time's up. Okay, the answer was page objects, but I guess that didn't let anybody answer it, so that's interesting. The answers didn't show. Okay, let's go to the next one. Hopefully this one shows up. Okay, same ranking then for everybody. What type of tests do we want? Do we want interpersonal tests? Do we want interdependent tests? Do we want international tests? Or do we want independent tests? 7 seconds remaining. What type of tests do we want? Looks like those are answering this time. I'm not sure what was wrong with that last one. They should have tested their software more, or I should have tested the presentation more. Yes, we want independent tests, right? We don't want tests that are interdependent on each other. If they're interdependent on each other, then it matters what order we run them in, and that's not what we want. Okay, got lots of people still doing well here. Let's see how many people. Oh wow, lots of people still in the top score there. Very good. What was one thing that Mark suggested could help with making tests run in parallel? So one thing I suggested will help tests run in parallel. Adding random numbers to stuff. Or I never said to try to run tests in parallel. Using the same name for all inputs. Doing setup in one test that is used by all the other tests. That's the one thing I suggested that could help with making tests run in parallel. 2 seconds remaining. And yes, adding random numbers to stuff. So what we don't want to do, I think I tricked a bunch of people off. That was probably on the wording. But what we don't want to do is set up in one test that's used by other tests. That can set you up in situations where it will, where if you can't run you ought to be able to run all your tests just completely independently. And this isn't unique to Selenium, but you ought to be able to run them independently in any order, and ideally any of them at the same time. Now, sometimes that's not possible. On most large projects I've been on, they try to get as many tests over to running as parallel as possible, but they usually have some they reserve that they have to set up to run sequentially just because there's no way to run them all at once because they need to change global settings or something like that. Okay, it looks like CK's in the top spot there. Let's see, do I have another question? Okay, what is the Selenium philosophy? Is the Selenium philosophy live long and prosper? Like a user but a robot? All the things all the time? Or if a user can't do it, we won't either? Selenium philosophy. And there are probably two that could be. I'm thinking of a specific one that I mentioned. So yes, the one I was thinking of was if a user can't do it, we won't either. Although you could probably make a case for like a user but a robot, but this is the one I was thinking of for this particular thing. Okay, oh, it looks like Richard G pulled in the top spot. So Richard, send me actually, let's do this with all three. So if you guys do not have it, and Astrid, I know you're in Germany, but I still would love to send you a copy. If I haven't sent you one already, I'm not sure if I have or not. Oh, you know, that kind of... Anyway, if you would like a copy, if any of these three people would like a copy of my productivity book, this contains strategies for everything from working with an unorganized box to ways to, or unorganized boss to ways to get rid of clutter, to getting more things done. And I think this even has one about the best way to organize your socks and optimal parking strategies for parking lots. Okay, so anyway, send me a screenshot with your address. I will get you a copy of this book if you're one of the winners. And let's switch over here. if you can fill out the feedback really, really quickly while I get ready to switch over, I would appreciate that. So like I said, okay, so we looked at first, the name of the book is Productivity. Productivity Making the Difference by Mark Shead. And it's not necessarily about Agile at all. It's back when I was doing lots of stuff with personal productivity blogging and stuff. Okay, so now we're going to look at some actual code. So please do fill out the survey. It's very, very helpful to me to fill that out. I'll leave that up and running while we jump over and we start looking at some code. So now we're going to look at code. First part was just kind of overall of Selenium. Now let's look at some code here. And then we'll hopefully have some time for some questions if you want to see how some of these things work. So this is an application, a very, very simple application. And what it does, let me just demo it for you. So I'm going to run this demo application right here. It's a Spring application. And I actually have this available online. You can go to, if anybody's interested, let me know and I can send you the link to it. Let me drag this over here now. Okay, so here's our application. So here's the application running. I think if you look for Spring, Angular, Cucumber demo, some of the frameworks it's using are kind of outdated. I need to update it. But it's very, very simple. It's using the original version of Angular on the front end. When I increment this, it goes up, but it's actually going all the way through Spring to do that. So it's going to the server and then coming back. Server's running here locally. And then this was the thing I was showing you earlier, where I can click here and I can say if I add the numbers 1 and the numbers 3 and then click add, and then it gives me the number down there. So extremely simple application, but simpler we keep it, the easier it is to see what we're doing when it comes to testing. So that's the app. Arif, go ahead and send it to my email address, like where you got the invite from, should get to me, because this will disappear when I'm through, when you send me the address. Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, so let's go back to this and kind of talk through what this does. So like I said, it's a very simple application. So here is a very simple test right here. Let me stop. I'm going to stop the application from running. Here is a simple test using the page object. So I go to the demopage.go and then I add that number together. So let me run this real fast here. I think this will actually bring up what I need. Okay, so it flashed there really, really quick. But if you look, let me run it one more time. If you look, it was actually bringing up Chrome, going to the page, clicking on stuff, and then checking for the results. And just to prove that it that it is doing what we wanted, I'm going to change this to 100 here. And run it. And our expectation should be that it will actually fail. I think we got a failure here. Right. It expected 100, but it got 10. Well, 10's the right one. I just broke my test. So it is actually checking it, even though it goes by really, really fast. But you can see what's happening there. It pulls it up. One more time because it's really fast. It pulls it up, goes to the application, does the test, checks for the results, and then goes on. And my test is passing. So if you remember, down here is the same test, but it's a lot harder to maintain. So notice all this stuff that has to go into it down here to check for the same thing. And just to show you, doing the same thing here. But if I had to maintain this test right here, that's going to be a lot harder for me than trying to maintain this test we see up here. So let's dig into that page object and look at what that looks like. So if I go to, let's see. I've been using this for a while. Okay, so if you notice here, when I call the go method, it goes to this and goes to the page that I've defined. This is my demo page.java. So everything that I need to do with that demo page is represented in here. And if you notice, I can go to the page, I can add the numbers, and all that code we had to actually fill out the form is represented here just under add numbers. So like, for example, my login page might just have a login. It takes a username and a password, and then it figures out how to navigate through everything. If my login process changes, and instead of being all, username and password on one page, it's username on one and then password on the next one, that can all be abstracted away in my login page. and I only have to change it in that one place. And then here's the code to get the results of the addition. And there's the one for these down here for the get counter and click increment is to do the things with the testing the other stuff on the page that we haven't looked at. So by representing this, basically what I'm doing is I'm creating an API that represents my application. So I'm building my application in code, but then I'm also creating an API that can talk to it. And then I'm using JUnit or something like that to drive the page object to do the things I want to check, which then talks to Selenium, which talks to the actual application. This particular approach, particularly for UI stuff, it's useful, but this can also make sense if you're doing in a lot of other areas, or maybe not a lot, but in other areas where you need to test something and it's worth investing in creating a good API just to be able to get to where you need to see things to test it. So that's what the demo page does. Okay, so let's go back over here. Okay, so there's the demo page, and then I've got, that's where it just was. Okay, yeah, so there's the simple one. There's the more complicated one. Now, I had mentioned about having the configuration in one place. So here is my configuration for this application, for my test. So this is my test configuration. And if you notice here, I have this method that actually gets me the WebDriver. So if you saw the other place where I actually instantiated the WebDriver, in this case, I'm making a decision about whether I need the Mac or Chrome driver. We could add Linux to it if we wanted to. I'm setting the property for where the driver path is, and then I'm creating the Chrome driver and returning that. So in my page object over here, I'm declaring the driver, and then it's being injected in and auto-wired right here. So if I need to change something with my driver, I can change it in that test config. So if you notice here, this doesn't even know that it's a Chrome driver. If for some reason I wanted to run this in a way that instead of Chrome, it uses Firefox, I can actually change that here and run all my tests with Firefox. I could even make it a parameter so I could have two computers come up at the same time and one run it all against Firefox and one run it all against Chrome and another against Edge or something like that. Or I could use Selenium Grid or something like that for it. So yes, Spring Voodoo, that's what's going on. It's not so important that this is done in Spring. We could do all this manually, but the point we want is we want this located in one place. I've been on projects that weren't using Spring, and we basically just used the singleton pattern to make sure we had one web driver that we could always get and use for things. This is also where we're telling it where to find the Chrome driver. What I found usually works pretty good is I like to have the Chrome driver just checked in to a bin directory in my resources, so it's always right there. There are other approaches to it. What I like about that is if I change something and get it working on my computer and check it in and it's running on CI/CD, I may want it to be using the same driver or the same version of the driver as what I just got working. Now you can still run into all kinds of problems if somebody doesn't have Chrome updated on theirs and they get out of sync, so it's not foolproof. But checking it in my experience, has made it a lot easier than some of the other ways we tried it. Okay, let me see if there's anything. I think that covers the big stuff that's just about Selenium. We can take a look at how Selenium interfaces with behavior-driven development and Cucumber if you want, but I want to pause there for a second and ask, does anybody have any questions about this? Is there anything you want to see in the code or any questions about anything we've discussed while we're at this point? Any questions? Anything that stuck out as being interesting? Or anything that you found a way to do that's better than what I suggested here? Does this kind of make sense? Does it make sense what you're seeing? Okay. Is the page object model being still heavily used in the industry, or is it fading away? Somebody just asked. Replaced with what? Is there a particular thing you've heard of it, you've seen people trying to replace it with? So if there's something, the things I've seen to replace a page object model looked like they were still accomplishing the same goal. I haven't seen anything that really, I haven't seen any approaches that look like they would gain any traction that were fundamentally different. I have seen some people try to structure the pages differently. For example, I've seen people saying, we don't want this structured so much around the page because we've got a single page application. So we're going to structure, instead of being structured around pages, it's going to be more around the functionality that people are using or something like that. I don't consider that to be a completely separate thing. It's just your page objects are now being sliced a different way and you call them something else, but you're still having that API that lets you express the intent and abstract away the code that actually does that. So I would say I haven't seen places that are moving away from that that are actually being successful. I did see some things that tried to do, they called it something different that was very, very similar. I don't remember what it was because I don't think it stuck around very long. But if there is something you're thinking of that people were using instead page object, I'd love to hear about it and take a look at it, or we can talk about it. Reason to choose Spring Boot for Selenium. So I think you're saying that this made it this makes it all easy because we were using Spring Boot for it. Interestingly enough, I think that what Spring's helped with here is it's made it easier to inject the singleton, the WebDriver. But on other projects I've been on that didn't use Spring Boot, that actually was probably the easier thing to do. The thing that I think Spring did a good job of here that kind of was, I didn't really detail, it was kind of hand-wavy magic. But this right here, this thing right here where I've got Spring Boot test, and I'm saying the class is demo application, this is very, very handy because it means when I run this, it's going to actually start up the application. And then this is also where I do the web environment. So those things have been helpful. So what I'm trying to say is, I think the value in this particular example, at least when writing this, that I thought was really valuable, wasn't so much Selenium specific things as it was being able to bring specific things, as it was being able to actually handle these types of dependencies and have the testing infrastructure. So the testing infrastructure Spring made easier. I think you can just use Spring Test for that as well. It made that part easier. The actual Selenium, other than having the that singleton object to get the WebDriver, I think is pretty much going to be the same. It doesn't interact a lot with Spring other than that part of it. At least that's what I'm thinking. Config is loaded from file and it's hard to test various configuration. Okay. And Astrid, what I've found, what we've done sometimes, like this thing right here where I'm actually pulling it from, well, let me give a different example. I was working on a big project one time, and we needed to, when you ran it locally, we were using H2 database, but once it got into CI/CD, it was using a different database. What we did there is we had that particular, like which database to use. Spring was actually looking in the environment and switching back and forth depending on what environment it was in. And that worked really well because once we set it up, we didn't have to think about it anymore. If we ran it on our laptops, it worked one way. If we ran it on the AWS containers, it worked another way. And those were always what we were expecting. And there were ways to override it as well if we needed to. So I think there's sometimes ways to get some of those things easy to switch back and forth. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're talking about or not. But yes, if you're trying to run it after change it after it's been loaded, then things get really exciting. And I think Spring will let you do it if you know, like you mentioned, the dark ways of Spring voodoo. Oh, okay, you got things different per customer. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, Cypress Playwright. Somebody's mentioning Cypress Playwright, Serenity screenplay patterns. The screenplay patterns that I've seen look like, I'll have to look at that. Maybe they've developed into something else, but I think a lot of those were doing things very similar to page out. You're still trying to abstract. You're trying to accomplish similar things to abstracting stuff as you were trying to do with page objects. But I may be wrong. I haven't looked at some of that stuff for a long time. Somebody was asking, Richard asked, how does Selenium compare with other tools such as Cypress? So Cypress, I believe, and Cypress does some pretty cool things, But I believe, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, Cypress isn't actually remote controlling the browser from the outside. I think Cypress is running inside the browser and doing things with JavaScript. Does that sound right? Does anyone know if I'm misspeaking there? Which lets you do some things that are really, really cool. It also, I think, sets you up for possibly, okay, I see confirmation. It works inside the browser. It lets you do some things that are really, really cool, but I think it also sets you up for possibly running into some issues you won't run into otherwise. Selenium actually used to work that way. It used to be something that was being remote controlled by JavaScript instead of it being something where you were actually talking to the browser API. And I think Cypress has done a lot better job of it than maybe and I mean, JavaScript has evolved a lot. It's done a lot better job of it than what Selenium was doing at the time. I've seen people very excited about using Cypress for things. I haven't seen anyone that's actually worked on a project that's gotten up to where they were dealing with like an enterprise level application that was completely tested with Cypress, particularly anybody that's using it with like behavior driven development or something like that. It's not that it couldn't happen. I just haven't seen it. The other thing, I'm trying to remember if Cypress does a lot of injecting stuff in the back end or if it's actually usually working against a live application. And I think, if I remember right, you could do it both ways. As somebody saying, it has limitations like opening a new tab, which is something you can do with Selenium, but it does start getting really, really tricky when you've got other tabs opening up. But there are ways to do stuff like that. Let's see. And it's been a while since I've looked at Cypress, but I've seen a lot of people excited about it. One thing to think about, though, if I was starting a project today for a client that was expecting, like, we were creating software, it was going to be 2 or 3 years of development time, and then we were expecting this application to be used for the next 15 years, I would consider there to be significant risk of trying to use Cypress versus trying to use Selenium. Just because Selenium has such a wide usage that if it met our needs, I'm pretty sure Selenium is going to continue to be around and continue to be updated for the life of the application. Cypress, I would have a little less confidence that was going to be the case. It doesn't mean that it won't be, and it could be a great thing, but I think you've got to balance the longevity of your application and the importance of your tests with how long you think the chances that something might disappear and not be around anymore. There's also a difference when it comes to testing. If I'm mostly just trying to automate tests that a user would do. So I have a user, or I have people doing QA stuff, and they go through and test all these things, and I'm going to automate that process and test all those things. I would be much more comfortable using Cypress in a situation like that than I would with Selenium, because I'd be more comfortable using Cypress in a situation like that than I would if I was in a situation where we were actually using BDD to drive the creation of code, and our testing code we saw as being just as important as the actual application. A question somebody asked, will Selenium remain a market leader for the next 10 years? It might not, and the point I'm trying to say when it comes to risk is something may displace Selenium. But if I don't know for sure what that is, I may be less risky using Selenium than I am in trying to guess what the next thing is that's going to be used. Case in point, I don't know if any of you were using Protractor with Angular, and it was like, great, did all these cool things, and then finally they got into some stuff as Angular developed that they couldn't do what they needed to anymore, and then it just kind of got shut down. I was working on some projects that were heavily invested in it when that happened, and so it made me a little bit gun shy in thinking, okay, if my testing environment is really important and my testing code is just as important as my application code, how do I make sure I set myself up so my customers can continue to use this for the life of their application? But I think you're completely right. Selenium may not be the thing that lasts forever, but it probably will still be there and probably will still be updated over the next 10 years. Let's see. Somebody had asked about, did somebody ask about behavior-driven development? Because I can show you that. Is there anything else in this that people want to see, or any questions about it? Otherwise, I'll show a little bit about the BDD just in case that's interesting to anyone. Okay. Well, if there's something else you wanted to see or other questions, let me know. But for now, let me take a look at show us BDD. All right. Okay. So if I'm in my test directory here, there's Java, there's resources, there's my bin directory, but down here are my BDD scenarios. So I have these different features stated as behavior-driven or as Cucumber, right? Add 2 positive numbers. Given I'm on the demo page, when I add the numbers 2 and 3, then the result is 5. And I can actually click through here and go to this. So I have my adder.feature, and then these are represented behind the scenes with a steps file. And that's cool. It shows me what it does. So that's what it's matching against, is this given that shows up in my steps file. So I'm going to click through and go to my steps file. And here you'll see I've got this steps file right here. This steps file is actually calling things in my demo page. You're asking about sharing the code with us. Yes, I'll try to send this out to everyone. This is available on GitHub. I may try to update it with newer versions of stuff, although this version did work for me. But yes, this is, a matter of fact, if you look for BDD demo Mark Shead, you'll probably find it. But I'll try to send that out to everybody at the end of this. So now I'm back what I had showed you where we weren't using BDD. I'm back to about the same place here, right? I've got demo.go. And just to be clear, this code, though, is designed to be very, very, very simple. I wouldn't build a whole application off this code, but sometimes it's nice to be able to see it working so you can figure out how to make it work in more complicated examples. So this is then going to go to the page object and call go on it like we looked at before. So using my page object, I can call those directly from a test, or I can call them from a steps file that is being called by a BDD test. And if you look down here, this looks very familiar too. So I'm doing a lot of the same things. I'm just now driving it with behavior-driven development. And then the way that we actually run this might be interesting if you haven't seen it, is, let's see, under test. So let me go back to my Java. So I've got this demo page IT, and then I've got run cucumber test. And let me try running this. I haven't, I don't think I ran this because I wasn't planning on getting into this, but let's just see if that comes up. Oh yeah, and all my scenarios passed. So the thing that's actually driving Cucumber here is this very simple run Cucumber IT test. But see up here where we say run with the Cucumber class, that's actually going to call Cucumber, and Cucumber is going to take care of figuring out how to run everything. Cucumber is going to go in and figure out, okay, I've got all these feature files. I need to take these feature files, and then I need to match them up to my steps files, which are right here. Match it up to the steps file and make sure that I have a way to do all the steps that I'm trying to do. So that's how that piece works. Any questions about that? I mean, that's really, we could spend, we sometimes have talks that cover that as the entire talk. Any questions about that or any thoughts? If you've got a question that's not easy to type, feel free to come off mute and let me know what you think. Okay, well, that's the general way that piece works.
Where do you point Cucumber to run it by in the Selenium thing? Is this done in the configuration of Cucumber or where?
Right. So okay, that's a very good question. So if you notice here in the demo steps, I'm just referring to my page object. So my page object, if I go back to that page object again, it's working the same way. It works the same way for the page object, regardless of whether I'm calling it from Cucumber or calling it from JUnit.
Spring Voodoo again. Okay, thank you.
Right. Yes. But I think that's an important thing. I'm glad you brought that up. The way that our infrastructure works for the page object is independent of whether we're going to call it just directly within an integration test in JUnit, or whether we've got JUnit calling Cucumber, calling steps file, calling the demo page. And this can be pretty powerful because there might be sometimes that you have something where you're like, We need to test this. It's really complicated to express in behavior-driven development. It doesn't have a lot of meaning to the business users. So we're just going to work with the page and do stuff in a unit level or integration test level without having Cucumber involved in it. And if we create our page objects in the right way, that becomes something else we can use in those types of tests. It's not limited to just being in Cucumber. Good question. Okay, so that covers what I was hoping to cover today. And I'm going to stop my streaming and we'll see if anybody else has any other questions. And if not, we'll hope to see you next week.